This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 404, Not Found. Okay, we had to make that joke, but really today we're talking about Drupal content modeling. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we're talking about Drupal content modeling with our hosts. I'm Nick Laughlin, founder at Enlightened Development, and today my co-hosts are, as usual, John Picozzi, solution architect at EPAM.
Hi, everyone. How's everyone doing?
Also joining us for the next 4 weeks, Sean Walsh, co-founder at CrowdCG. Sean has been working with Drupal since 2009. He builds and maintains sites for higher education and nonprofit clients. He organizes Drupal Camp New Jersey and the Central New Jersey Web Developers Meetup. Currently, he is the secretary of the Drupal Event Organizers Working Group. Welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us.
Hi, thanks. Happy to be here.
We also have a short drop in here. Amy June was going to join us today to talk about the Drupal Coffee Exchange, but she had to reschedule. We will be talking about the Drupal Coffee Exchange at a later date, so don't worry. She did want to let our listeners know that the next Drupal Coffee Exchange BOF will be at the Drupal Camp Asheville, which is July 7th through 8th in Asheville, North Carolina. Bring a bag, take a bag. And I assume those are bags of coffee, since it's a coffee exchange, but I've never been to one. You can visit DrupalAsheville.com to find out more about the camp. And now to talk about our module of the week, let's bring in Martin Anderson-Klutz, a senior solutions engineer at Acquia and maintainer of a number of Drupal modules of his own. Martin, what do you have for us this week?
Thanks, Nick. This week, we're going to talk about the Field Tools module, which provides tools to analyze and manage your use of fields and display modes in a Drupal website. It was created in November of 2011. It has a current version of 8.x-1.0 Alpha 10, which is ready for Drupal 10, and also a D7 version. It is actively maintained. It has 43 open issues, but only 13 of those are for the 8.x versions, and only 9 of those are bugs, which is pretty impressive when you consider that the module is in use by over 5,700 websites. Now, it was created by Joachim, apologies if I didn't get that pronunciation right, who himself maintains a pretty impressive list of modules. And really the way the module works is by generating different kinds of reports, even a chart to help better understand the fields that you have defined on your Drupal site. It also provides the ability to clone a field instance between bundles, even in bulk. And it provides the ability to clone form and view displays between bundles with support for field groups. Now, I personally first heard about this module because I happen to maintain the entity relationship diagrams module, and Joachim made a comment on an issue in there about potentially bringing in that sort of ERD diagramming capability into Field Tools. So that may be something that's in the future. But if you also want to explore an alternative, there's also a newer module called Content Model Documentation, which includes similar capabilities, can also generate an ERD, but is currently in use by only 12 sites. So let's talk about the Field Tools module. Anybody used either Field Tools or something in some way similar?
I have not, and I feel like I've been sorely missing out. I mean, I feel like when I'm trying to evaluate this stuff, I spend half my time going between the Drupal field report page and then, views and bundle managed field tabs and stuff. So I'm definitely going to be checking this out. It sounds like it's useful just for, kind of a bird's eye view of what your site is doing, which can sometimes be difficult and, traditionally is sometimes relegated to spreadsheets as well. So yeah, I'm definitely going to check this out.
Yeah, I have it on one project where we were just building a whole bunch of things that needed the same fields over and over again. So it does help with cloning a lot of things over, view modes over. So I've used it in a very limited capacity on that one project, but did the job. So
I have nothing to add. I've never used said module, and I also am interested in using it because it does sound very interesting and helpful.
Yeah, I think that the cloning capabilities definitely sound interesting because you can obviously reuse fields, but then there's a lot of, sort of like setting defaults and things that don't necessarily come through automatically. So that ability to sort of clone, I think, is really useful.
Yeah, and you may have said this and I may have missed it, but what's the like? Can anybody think of a use case where you would want to clone a field like directly like that? Because I mean, you have reuse, obviously. You just said that, but like, I'm wondering like what the like multiple content types that have the same exact field on them, I guess, right?
So in like higher ed, I can think like you have, instead of having just a person type, you might have like a student and a faculty type, and they might share a lot of base fields, name, other random things, biofields, stuff like that. So that kind of is where I think we use it on this one project, is just to kind of simplify some of the need for, having those basic things over across multiple content types that were somewhat similar but had different use cases.
Yeah, and I think some things like translation status sometimes doesn't always. I think it uses the original one that you set, but if you've copied it before and set like different translation rules, and that's what you need for all the other ones, it sounds like this will handle that as well. Yeah, it's a cool module. I'll definitely check it out and let you know what I think, I guess. Well, thank you, Martin. As always, another on-topic module of the week in short order because we had to kind of shift gears. So talk to you next week.
Thanks, Nick.
Okay, let's start with our traditional, maybe easier question, I guess. What do you guys think of when you think of Drupal content modeling? What is it?
So I think, content modeling, if you go to the interwebs and you search for content modeling, content modeling means defining the structure of your content at a granular level, right? This goes on to say it involves analyzing requirements, determining what kind of content you need, identifying structure, deciding how it should be structured, and then developing or building that out. So I mean, when we say content modeling, it really to me means like defining your entities, right? Defining how your site is, going to use entities within Drupal.
From my perspective, yeah, I mean, a lot of it is that planning stage, whether you're starting a greenfield project or you're adding something onto a site that already has other content. It's that inventory. It's that like real gut check of like, do we have all the things we need? Especially from client projects, like identifying like where something is going to be a specific type of field or how data is going to get stored, and kind of defining as much of that up front so that as you start to build, you can kind of go through that process quickly without having to go back and forth a lot, I think is the kind of big thing. And it gives you that chance to like really think about the interconnectedness of content that we find, especially in the Drupal world where we like to do lots of references, is, figuring out where those joins might be and, how to best leverage those kinds of things.
I think you said something interesting there, Sean, because I think content modeling kind of changes between a greenfield project where you're starting from the ground up and where you're doing like a migration, right? Because I think we've all done kind of both of those, right? And content modeling in a migration is, I don't know, sometimes feels a little bit harder because you often want to kind of clean up in a migration. You don't want to just blindly say like, oh, whatever the content model was previously, we're going to duplicate it. Cause like sometimes it can be done more efficiently. It can be done better. So in those scenarios, sometimes you end up building out like almost two content models of like, here's the old one, here's the new one. And here's how the fields kind of transfer from one to the other.
Yeah. I think there's one key thing too, that has been mentioned. That's like, obviously when you're setting up content modeling, you're setting up the relationships between content, but you're also specifically thinking about how the data is stored and what the content editor is able to put into these fields, right? So we'll talk more nitty-gritty details, but for example, is it a select list versus a taxonomy versus a plain text field? Like, what are and each of those are valid in certain situations. You have to think about, how they're working. it's linked pretty closely to the editorial experience, but in my book, it's not. It is slightly different. So, for example, um, if it's a taxonomy field, you can make the decision on the editorial side that it's a tagging type thing where they can put in new taxonomy directly in the form, or not. They have to go to the they have to have somebody who has permission to go to the vocabulary and add the taxonomy, right? But from the content modeling, that distinction is a little less important. I mean, it is, because you have to think about whether or not you're going to get duplicates or misspellings, that kind of stuff. But in general, that the content model piece it's a reference to something that can change. So storing the identity, the ID of the taxonomy, rather than the actual value. It's not as rigid as, for example, a list. So it's a little bit separate from the user experience, or the editorial experience, but it is coupled with that, right?
Yeah, and I think that comes from different perspectives when you're doing content modeling, right? So when I've done content modeling in the past, I've always included the development team, because they're thinking exactly like that, Nick. They're thinking like, how do we store this data? And like, when the data has to come out of it, like it goes into the database, when it comes out, how's it going to come out? And like, what do we need? How do we need that, right? Like specifically for me, when I look at content modeling, like I kind of think of it in two ways. One is like, hey, what are the flat fields? Like literally, what is the information this content type or this entity has to have? And then like the second part there is like, how is the admin going to enter this, and how is it going to be most effective to make sure that what we get in matches what we expect, and then what we want to get out. So yeah, it definitely is something to think about there.
I also want to bring up one thing that I think that is unique about Drupal, and I'd like to hear your perspectives, and that is Drupal is really well known for being super robust around content modeling, but I think more than most other projects out there, because a lot of projects can do content modeling, right? Any CRM or CMS can do content modeling on some level, but I think Drupal stands out in its ability to control most of that through the UI, but also track it in config management, right? So you get the best of both worlds. You can quickly change things in the UI, but you also have kind of a Git history, seeing who changed what when, and you can kind of react on that. There are a ton of systems out there where you can do the content modeling in code, and so you can track that in Git, right? Silverstripe is one of them. You define all your fields in code. That gets translated into the database. You can easily see who changed what where. WordPress has tools like advanced custom fields, which lets you kind of do the Drupal side of things. Like you can edit it in the browser, create new fields, add them to post types. But translating that to code is a little less, like you kind of have to choose one or the other. Either you do it in the UI or you do it in code. You don't get both, and I think that's a little bit unique in Drupal. I'm not aware of other projects that do that. What do you guys think?
Yeah, a lot of things I've used, like Strappy, taken a look at Craft in the past, do a bunch of WordPress stuff. So yeah, a lot of these are more like defining in code, setting up all the things. Some of them have a little bit more clicky interface stuff, but I think Drupal is kind of uniquely positioned in this modeling of content, that you get developer experience and you get user experience.
Yeah, I think you just highlighted something there. I think you're right, Nick. I think you get you get a great benefit of the config management system in Drupal, and being able to kind of save out once you create a content type through the UI, being able to save that out into config. I think one other thing that you highlighted there that I don't think we have covered yet was the fact that content modeling isn't just a Drupal thing. Like today we're talking about Drupal content modeling, right?
Yeah.
But ultimately you can content model almost anything. I think you highlighted it with like CMS, CRM. Like you could even you can content model years ago, I used to content model via wireframe, where I would call out like, hey, here's a wireframe of a page. Here's the fields that we're going to need to support that, and so on and so forth. So I think like content modeling could really apply to any application. And, I think that's something to keep in mind. So now that we have a pretty good understanding of what content modeling is, or at least at a high level, right? I'm wondering how it helps your projects, or how you've seen it help your projects. And, I think we discussed this a little bit while answering that previous question about like kind of mappings between like an old site going to a new site. But I'm wondering if there are any other practical use cases that we may have experience with that we could share with our listeners.
I've definitely have some thoughts, but I'd like to hear what you think first, Sean.
Sure. So on a pretty recent project, we migrated the site from Drupal 7 up to 9, and we had like sins of the past that had to be cleaned up, right? So when we were doing that project, and John, you were mentioning this before, that like that migration piece is like, I think, a good point where you can kind of clean things up too, right? We took a lot of overly unnecessary fields and disparate things and really consolidated those down. So it really does help kind of give you some laser focus as to what you want to get in and you want to get out. In this case, they had like, a dozen, taxonomies, and we reduced it down to like 4 or 5, right? It really helps kind of help you, realize how you're going to use that data and not just storing data for data's sake. And it does give you the ability to do those things like you said, where is this a list? Is it a taxonomy? I've made that mistake in the past and had to, undo that thing later on down the project, where it's like, oh, it's not just adding a new one, which is not that bad right now. It's also, we're now going to delete this one and we want to redirect it to this other piece, right? So like having that ability to really, during a project, see a big picture, I think is the kind of big important part for me.
Yeah. So for me, I think there's a few key things. One, first of all, content modeling is, a discussion with a bunch of different stakeholders, right? It's not, there's no perfect, correct content model for every project. There's always some give and take. So one of the things that I'm asking when I'm building a content model or reviewing one is, what functionality do we need to support? What information do we need to be able to display in what situations? And how difficult is it for editors to maintain the content, right? So for example, if you're thinking about like a product, right, it's pretty obvious that you need a price for a product, right? That's an easy one. But you might also want to be able to prevent certain products from being discounted, right? So you need to have a way to define which products are not discountable, right? And there's a bunch of ways you could do that. So if we're talking about specific solutions, I've had clients where there's just a checkbox on products, but even that says whether it's discountable or not. But even that is a decision, right? Is it discountable if it's checked, or is it discountable if it's not checked, right? And which way does it default? So when you're looking at these types of things, one of the things that you want to ask, for example, with the discountable question is, what should the default be? And how often is somebody going to have to tweak that, right? How many, if they have 1,000 products, which situation is more common? Are they more commonly discountable? So we should just make it the default, and maybe you're opting out. You also need to know, like, how risky is it to allow a discount for something that shouldn't be discounted, right? If allowing a discount on something is going to cost the company $50,000 and be a severe issue, well, then maybe you default to not discountable. So there's a lot of questions that go into, or there's a lot of variables that go into not even just what is the type of field that you're doing, but also how is that working. I have another client that handled discountability based on other attributes, right? So there wasn't a checkbox. There was like, if the product is newer than this age and over this value, you can't discount it. I have another client that handled discountability with a separate reference. So when they were creating a coupon or a discount code, they would just explicitly list the 5 or 6 items that they didn't want discountable, or taxonomies, right? So there's all 3 of those are solving the same problem. They have some products that want to be discounted and some that don't, but there's 3 very, very different solutions. And there's no one that's the correct solution. There's only one that's the correct solution for a particular client, a particular use case.
Mm-hmm.
So to answer the original question, how does content modeling help your project? It helps you define, features. It helps you define how much interaction editors are going to have with the site, how much interaction end users going to have with the site.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, I think one thing that you also highlighted there is that it helps to define what could be like a content editor kind of business rule, as opposed to a like, hey, we have to code a solution for this, right? So like, I know in Drupal Commerce, right? Drupal Commerce system kind of gives you the ability to enter product codes that or SKUs that a coupon code will apply to, right? So that can become more of a business decision as to like, hey, inventory manager or discount manager, like, don't enter these codes into this promotion, because we don't ever discount those, right? And it becomes less of a need for the development team to kind of do extra development, maintain that code, potentially create a vector for technical debt. So you can kind of have those conversations alongside your content modeling with like, hey, do we really need to like build a checkbox for this and manage that logic? Or is it simply something that we could just do at the business level?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. I think there's one other thing that really you kind of hinted at, Sean, but didn't explicitly state. But I think one of the biggest things that content modeling can help, especially when you're moving from an existing content model, like you're upgrading from 7 to 8 or 9 or 10, is performance. There are so many times in Drupal 7, I'm working on a project right now where we're doing this, where we had an entity, we created a second entity type, and that second entity type would reference the first entity. And so a lot of our views would then have to have relationships, like reverse relationships, in order to join those together, which is a little bit slower. And so when we're migrating into the new system, we're just reversing that relationship. So entity 1 now references the many entity 2s that it should reference. So when you're displaying that, it's much easier to do the lookup in that direction. So you can do a lot of things like that. Another related thing is especially if you have nested entities, and there's a lot of them, that can be very, very slow, but it's also laborious for content editors to maintain, right? And it's error prone. But if you have a system where they're creating the entity 2 and referencing entity 1, you can always have some sort of automated process that migrates that data and flattens it out, right? So you have a system. So the editors are maintaining the data in a way that makes sense to them, but then the system is flattening that data so that when it's accessing it, it can be way more performant. So there's ways that content modeling can help the performance, both on just the actual performance of the application, but also the performance and accuracy of just entering the data, right? Because if the business thinks about the data relationship one way, getting them to reverse that or invert that sometimes is it's a losing battle, and it's a battle that you shouldn't have, especially since you can just write a function to invert that relationship as needed and cache it.
For sure. So, kind of moving along this line of discussion, I think, in Drupal specifically, we talk about entities, right? We have nodes, which are content types and all those kinds of things. We have taxonomy terms. We have users, which are another type of entity. How are you modeling for all those things? And I think there's also this thing called storage entities, which are just like data in and of themselves that aren't really like user, like an editor kind of specific piece of code. How are you doing that in your projects? So do you do all of them, just some of those things?
I think you typically the way I've done it is I've only done some of those things, right? So, um, years ago, X number of years ago, I would take the wireframes from the design team and I would start kind of working out um, you know, what we needed to kind of like model out and how we were going to do certain pages, right? Which typically would break down to like content types. So that would kind of be our starting point is like, okay, content types. So to support this page, we need a blog content type, for example. That blog content type has to have an entity reference to a taxonomy. Okay, well, what taxonomy? Okay, blog category. Okay, we're going to create a blog category taxonomy. Now, that's usually where I would stop that line, right? With like, hey,
Yeah.
we've created the content type. There are more fields on the content type, obviously, but like, hey, we get to the taxonomy. If the taxonomy for some reason needed special fields or needed more than just the term, right? Something outside of what like core does, then I would say, okay, let's dive into that and figure out what that is and model that. But typically I'd just say, okay, like you just need a default taxonomy. Okay, cool. Then I would go back to Nick's point, like on the blog, right? And say, all right, well, is this going to be an autocomplete? Is it going to create terms based on the fact that the term doesn't exist? Like, how is that gonna work, right? Kind of define those requirements there as well. And then I would work through a site like that. So like going through, to your point, Sean, users, right? So like if a user had a more robust profile field, like that would be something that maybe we would model out as to how like a piece of content maybe gets tagged to a user, or if there was a user kind of like directory or display, like what that looked like. But typically I would start from content types and then work my way out into those other entities as I needed them.
So I follow a lot of those same rules. There's a couple of different things that I think about though. So first of all, I just want to clarify: storage entity here is referring to the storage module that Martin maintains. So it's kind of analogous to paragraphs. It solves a couple. In my book, it solves a couple of things that I think are really nice. That makes it a little bit nicer. It doesn't require entity reference revisions. It does allow you to have a label. What that really means is it makes like you can reuse a paragraph across content types. Like technically, like you can look up a pre-existing paragraph that somebody created and reference the same one, but then editing that paragraph or making changes to that is a little bit difficult. Whereas storage um, gives you that ability, and it also does give you a way to like search storage entities directly and modify them if you need to. So it's a little bit of in my book, it's a little bit of a cleaner implementation. But for me, I really think about kind of what the needs are. So like if it's something that's commonly going to be edited, and if it needs a page, then it's a content type, right? And if it's something that most editors, not advanced editors, need to tweak, I definitely lean towards a node, right? A content type, because there's just one place for adding that content. There's one place for editing, looking it up. It streamlines that process. Taxonomies, if something needs an hierarchy, 100% taxonomy. I mean, there's just really no way around that. You could kind of do hierarchies with books, but that's adding a lot of overhead. So if something needs an hierarchy, it's a taxonomy. I kind of do the same thing as John, though. I'm okay with adding like a small image field or one or two fields to a taxonomy to help. But once something starts requiring more than one or two extra fields that aren't just the name and hierarchy of the taxonomy, if that doesn't need an hierarchy, I definitely move towards something like a paragraph or a storage bundle, right? The only other one that I really think about are blocks, and I only generally create custom block entities when I'm using Layout Builder. If I'm not, I usually avoid that. And then, of course, the last common entity is the user. And I think you mentioned this a little bit earlier, Sean. That's one that I kind of struggle with. Like when you have a content type, when you have when you are modeling content and you have something that's a person, like a student or faculty, I always go back and forth on whether that should be a content type or just a user. It is.
So
I'm on both sides of that argument every week.
I have a pretty like strict rule about, I don't know, well, strict might be a little aggressive, but like I have a rule that I typically follow with that. If a user needs access to the site, like for example, they need to be able to update their user data, or they need to be able to log into the site for some reason, then like a user makes complete sense, right? But there are some sites, and I think your university edu site is a good example, where they're just displaying that data on the page, and like literally a web team edits it. So somebody puts a request into the web team and the web team edits it. In that case, I usually create like a people content type with a taxonomy to quantify like who that person is, right? So like, hey, now I can filter by student, I can filter by faculty, I can filter by staff if I need to. Right. And then that way there's no kind of security implication there, because there's just an unmanaged user account kind of like floating out there in the wind.
Yeah, I mean, sure. It goes back to like, what's the unique thing about that particular entity type that makes it worthwhile? So for me,
right,
content types give you a page and unified editorial experience as far as creating and editing content. Taxonomy gives you hierarchy, user gives you passwords, and then storage and paragraph kind of sit in the same place, where it's like you want a collection of fields, but you don't want all the overhead that comes with having a node, right? You don't want to either clog up the content editorial, content overview page with all this content that's like sub content, but you also don't need URLs. That's kind of where I land.
And then media is another entity that I think we're going to talk about in a little bit. But media is one where, sometimes depending on how that media is being used, like that becomes something that we content model, because it's, it's powering some sort of like media viewer or some sort of like library functionality where you have to look it up, or you have to tag it and sort it or something like that.
Yeah, media is the other big one.
Yep. In terms of users, I've always found that, like, to your point, like if you don't have to have an account that has like security implications, avoid it, right? Because I've inherited sites where the users were used for the content, and then like every time somebody joined the organization, you need to create a user account for them, and then they left the organization, you had to delete the user account. It just became a massive user management burden, when I just want to display some stuff on a page is very much this is content, and it's nothing to do with access management or permissions or anything like that.
Yeah, I think you raise a good point there. I think it also can add a lot of cruft as far as like managing those users, like, right? So like you have like certain organizations have certain policies. So once you start adding users for like no reason, you have to like manage password, rotation and account expiring, stuff and stuff like that. So yeah, steer clear of that, folks, if you can.
So my next question is, who handles content modeling? Like who should be in charge of determining what the content model is?
So as a resident solution architect, your solution architect should be handling your content model, but it's not just one person. It's actually a team effort. So as I said earlier on, I typically, the way that I've done content modeling in the past is working with the design team to develop kind of like high fidelity or annotated wireframes where the content model kind of lives next to or within the wireframe. And then we'll work with the dev team to kind of understand like, okay, well, you want to have an icon on this page in this spot. Okay, where does that need to live? Okay, is it a media item they're adding? Is it happening automatically? Is it coming from a taxonomy this page is being tagged with? It's part of the discovery process too, right? So like, this is happening kind of before we start building anything. We're bringing everybody together. So it's not just a like it's not just like an agency or a company thing, right? It's involving the client and getting their buy-in, especially in those migration cases, right? Because when you start migrating from one site to another, say Drupal 7 to Drupal 9 or 10, right? There are some instances where you might find a field that on the old site that's not needed anymore, or a field that could be used better on the new site. A couple of years ago, I was migrating, actually, I guess more like 3 or 4 years ago now. I was migrating a site from Drupal 7 to Drupal, probably Drupal 9 at that point. And we had that exact instance where there were a lot of fields that people were like, we have no idea what this field does, and it's blank on most of our content types, so we probably don't need it, which is like, great, let's get rid of it. And then we had that instance where it was like, oh, this field is like an open text field, but really should probably be a taxonomy with an autocomplete, because there's a very specific set of values that need to go in there in order for this to work right. So those are kind of the things that, you can, involving the client in that process really helps you kind of understand what the use cases are, and can make your content model that much better.
Before I turn to you, Sean, I was just chuckling because I was working on a migration project where there was a similar field. And so I presented to the client and one of the other developers, like, hey, I'd like to delete this field. No, it doesn't seem like it's really being used. And the developer was like, no, that's a very important field. We use it for all this stuff, all these calculations. And then the content editor is like, well, actually, I don't know what that field is. So I'd always just put a 1 in it no matter what. And so sometimes you find gaps in training or knowledge too, and can help build out too. So it helps there too. But how about you, Sean? Who kind of typically handles content modeling?
I think it's somebody with the technical knowledge of how the end product is supposed to be. So to John's point, like having that connection to the designs, having that connection to the various stakeholders is really important. Because ultimately the content model's got to serve the business use case, and you don't want everybody weighing in, and then you have a unique field for every single possible thing that somebody could want. I think editors tend to not see the forest through the trees, or whatever that metaphor is, right? When it comes to content stuff, every text field is its own bespoke text field, and it's like, well, can't you just put that in the one text field and style it? Oh yeah, we could totally do that. Or I just need to be able to section those things out. One thing I typically have on most projects is like a content area, which is a paragraph that basically allows them to add multiple text chunks between different parts of content. Because like mentally, for a lot of people, they need to see that visual break beyond just like the kind of like WYSIWYG editor interface, right? And so you end up doing kind of bending a little bit in terms of adding some more complexity, but from end user perspective, it's better. And that comes out obviously through conversations with all the different people who have to work on this thing long term.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with both of you. I would say one thing is it's definitely a valuable skill that takes a lot of experience and training to get really good at it. So you definitely want somebody more senior probably, because it takes, you have to have conversations with the client. You have to have conversations with the developer, with the designer, make sure that you're meeting all their needs. There's also compromise on all sides, right? I mean, there's certain business things that can't compromise, right? But in general, there's compromise on each side, right? If you build an extremely robust content model that can handle every situation, but then requires the person who's editing it to know 72 different paragraph components and know which one can be combined with which one in order to achieve this, like that's going to be a lot of mental load for somebody to manage. It's going to take a long time to train, and they're probably going to minimize using it because it's so difficult to process, right? I have a theory. I don't know the exact number, but if you give a robust content model to somebody, the majority of their site is going to be 3, 4, 5 components, right? They're going to have media, they're going to have some sort of text thing, maybe a column-based thing, and maybe there's 1 or 2 things unique to their site that they need. But even if you give them 30, 40, 50 components to model their content out, odds are the vast majority of those are either going to have, 0, 1, or 2 instances on the site, right? They're not going to remember all 40 different components that you have. They're just going to be like, well, I need text, or I need a 2-column layout, or I need some media, and that's what they're going to use. So it's a balance in simplifying it enough for the editor, but having enough information for the design, development, and business use cases to meet out. And that takes skill and a long time to train up. It sounds easy. It's one of those things where I was like, oh, I just need to know what the fields are on the site, right? But even as we discussed briefly, that discount process, depending on the needs of the project, there's 5, 6, 7, 8 different ways that you can handle it. And any one of those ways will work for all use cases. It's just some of them will be a massive amount of effort versus a different solution. And one of the other nice things about Drupal is you can modify the content model as new changes come up, but that can take significant effort, right? Sometimes it requires manually updating content and making sure it matches the new schema. Sometimes you can do it programmatically, but you definitely want somebody who has experience working on this. You don't want a junior developer who it's their first job out of college, doesn't have any experience building a content model, other than as a training exercise, I think.
Yeah, I've actually had instances where, not maybe specific to, well, sort of to a content model, right? Where I've gone on vacation, right, for a week, and I've come back and I've said, hey, we added this field to this content type. Why did we do it? And the developer looked at me and said, well, the client asked us to. And I'm like, okay, did anybody ask them why? And they said no. And I said, well, we already have like this taxonomy that does something very similar. Wouldn't it make more sense for us to maybe just add the taxonomy instead of creating a new field and just having like an open text field? And they said, oh, well, I don't know. And sure enough, you ask the client and they're like, oh yeah, sure, whatever, that would have worked. Yeah, no problem. But like, to your point, Nick, you need that more experienced individual to be able to ask the why, right?
Yeah. I have to say, one of my favorite things too is that in these migrations, especially for legacy clients, many times you have to store that data for a certain amount of time. Like, especially if you're migrating, you migrate in the old value just to have it so that they can reference in the new system to make sure and validate stuff. And then that just sticks around forever, and you're migrating again. And now you have like 3 fields. You have, current value, deprecated value, and really old deprecated value. But the business has grown around using all 3 of those values, and now you can't get away from it.
You don't have fields named new, newest, and best. New value, newest value, best value. Yeah, I was just going to say, we've talked about who kind of handles the content modeling. I'm wondering if we can touch on some best practices for content modeling. And Sean, I'm actually interested to hear from you, because one best practice that comes to mind is like documenting the content model, right? And then at the end of that process in discovery, making sure you present it to the client and then they approve it. Is that something that you typically do when you're developing a content model?
Yeah, I mean, definitely for those new projects or migration projects, there's definitely more structure in terms of like who gets to be the decision maker on how this stuff ends up.
Sure.
Again, they lean on you heavily to kind of filter things into the tech speak, I think, when they're more content people. And I think, in some projects, those decisions are pretty, easy to make without too much discussion and back and forth. So you don't end up with your newest, final, really the final one kind of fields. But then, I think, it's up to, there's got to be somebody who's kind of, again, overseeing this kind of stuff for that client. Because I think you do end up with the cruft, right? You do end up with the fields that sit there and die, that need to, be discussed and cleaned up, because why are you going to store a whole bunch of stuff that you're never going to use, right? Like once you're moved from like a Drupal 7 to a Drupal 910, and you had some legacy field you needed, but that legacy field has, served its purpose. Somebody's going to come back and be able to have that discussion and say, can we get rid of this? Here's what we should do. All the data's been moved. I've done projects where it's like, we went down a path of, using the regular old date field for something. And then it's like, all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, smart date exists now and we should totally use that. And then you have to write like a migration process in those fields. So I think it's a lot of, getting client buy-in, getting content owner buy-in to make sure that, the things that are there are actually serving their use case and not, just fields with one being entered into them, as Nick said.
Yeah. So I think like I guess my point there, right, is getting that client approval, because like the next step from like, hey, the content model is approved to like, is like, hey, we're going to build stuff, and nothing is more irritating to everybody than getting to like halfway through and then being like, oh, well, actually, no, wait. And you're just like, well, we talked about this like 16 times and this is the way we wanted to go. So
I think that's a good point, right? You need to validate. You can't just discuss the content model with the client. You actually have to show concrete examples and prototypes, because they're going to have sometimes they will intellectually agree with the content model until they actually try to use it. You also need to make sure that you're interacting not just with the business people, but the editors, because you might find out that they really need a particular feature in order to maintain something properly.
So like typically an interesting use case of that, or an interesting example of that, I guess, is where a marketing team is the owner of the project, right? So they're your stakeholder, they're making all the decisions, right? But as Nick just said, like content editors may have different ways they do things, might have different inputs. I've been in content modeling sessions where the marketing team's like, yeah, sure, whatever. We don't really care how that field works. And then the content editors are like, well, actually, like, this is how we use it. So like that might factor in. But like ultimately going back to those marketers and saying, okay, well, we talked to everybody. Here's like, you as the technical team are like kind of facilitators of like making sure the content model is, is serving everybody, and you're presenting kind of the best solution to the problem, I think. What are some other best practices that you guys use when content modeling?
I think there's two other big things, and that is you need to make sure, especially for longer running projects, it's different when you kind of like launch a project and hand it off to like an internal team or something. But if you're working on a project long term, you have to have a process for updating documentation, because content models change and evolve over time. And especially in the world of Drupal 8, 9, and 10, where we're seeing much fewer complete rebuilds, right? You should have a process in place, if you can, to occasionally prune your content model, right? As they grow, find out like, hey, yeah, date was the way to do things 5 years ago, but now we have smart date, and that handles all these great features. Or we used paragraphs for a long time, but now storage exists and we should see if that works for our use case better, right? Things like that. Or like, hey, this thing was a taxonomy for a long time, but it's grown organically and now it has 32 fields of its own, and we don't use hierarchy. We should probably move that to a content type, right? So you should have a periodic thing. I don't know how often it is, depends on the size of the organization, budget, all that kind of stuff. But I would say at a bare minimum, probably every 2 years or so. I mean, a more healthy, like robust, is probably every 6 months to a year. Just kind of take stock and see what you can do. But it's like most things. If you do it every 2 years, it's going to be a pretty big project to do. If you do it every 6 months, or as you're adding fields, it's maybe just a small half a sprint or something.
Yeah, I think one thing to note there, and this is kind of what you're getting at, is like content model is really a living document, right? And I mean, a lot of times, I don't know that I've ever updated a content model after a site has launched, right? But like during the development process, it's kind of that living document where you're like, okay, well, we need to add this field. Okay, well, if we add it, how is it going to impact everything else, and so on and so forth. Or you might even see that you miss something, like when you get to development, like, oh, hey, we actually need 2 fields here where we only identified 1. I think one other best practice, here to think about too is making sure that somebody kind of owns the content model, right? So like it's a team document. It's very collaborative, right? But somebody needs to own it. Somebody needs to be kind of keeping track of those changes and updates and kind of a decision log as to why things change. You know, typically that's your team lead, your senior developer, your solution architect, if you have one, right? But somebody needs to kind of own that. Obviously, getting input from various stakeholders, but just that's within their wheelhouse, I guess.
Yeah, and I'll for sure echo the same thing. Like documenting is kind of the best practice. You have to have your process. You have to have your documentation for all these kinds of things to just make everybody's life easier. You know, lots of writing, lots of communication. In terms of communication, you know, what are some of those questions that you ask stakeholders to kind of get to the, you know, the secrets that they're hiding? I think often comes to light, like, oh, well, why do you use this thing for this? Or why are these the 5 values for this field? And will that ever change? Right. There's a lot of like playing devil's advocate to questions sometimes for some content types, you know, especially like you said, commerce, right? Like, you know, would you ever have a product that has, you know, 5XL or triple extra small, or, you know, whatever it might be, right? Like, how do you think, you know, and ask stakeholders questions to kind of have them think about this thing as something that, like you said, John, is living. It's not like we get it, we check it, it's done, we move on, right?
I think it kind of takes it again. It's in two camps. Like content, there's two different types of content modeling: there's strategic content modeling and tactical content modeling, right? And I kind of approach them both ways. So if I'm talking to a business stakeholder, then I'm usually looking at like the pages, the views that are displaying lists of content, business metrics, things like that, and asking them things like, which of, you know, do you really need a list of blogs based on the second letter of their last name, right? So I'm asking kind of those strategic questions and how things are displayed. Like, do we need to have a special section for CEO blogs, right? Are they that important to promote? The strategic questions that I know are going to impact what gets stored on blog posts, for example. And then the second side of it is tactical. So again, it is critical when you're building a content model that you talk to the actual editors for the different various content. And with them, I'll more often literally kind of do what you implied, John, is go through the list of fields and say, what do you do with this field? What do you put into it? What do you wish you could put into it that you can't? Are there fields that you never touch? Are there fields that you always, which fields do you always fill out? What fields are required that you wish weren't required because you always forget to fill, like that kind of stuff. And then I'll, you know, try to use answers from both of those to, you know, and if there's a field, for example, that the content editor says that they almost never fill out or they always try to avoid filling out, but it powers a feature that the business stakeholder said was strategic, then I'll try to bring that question back around and be like, hey, you know, how important is this really? It's something that's really not being maintained. Do we need to create a business process to make sure it's properly filled out, or do we do something else, right? And vice versa.
I think, like, I don't know, maybe this goes under the best practice bucket, but it kind of goes under the question asking bucket too, right? Like, as the owner of the content model, again, whatever your role might be, like, you're like in these sessions, you're very much like an active listener, right? Of like, okay, like people are just going to talk and I'm going to listen, and then I'm going to jump in, and basically my question may sound repetitive, but it's always going to be like, why? Right? Why do you need that field? What's that field used for? Like, how is it, right? You know, how is it being used? So a lot of what Nick is saying. I think one thing that I try to do when content modeling too is thinking kind of long term, right? So like there's the here and now of like, you know, why is this field needed? Oh, because we need to put a number on a thing. Okay, great. But like, what does that look like in 5 years? What does that look like in 10 years? And I think one part of this is like, kind of future proofing a little bit, like big fan of that. But like, I think we have to change that focus now that we're looking at Drupal 9, Drupal 10, because ultimately in the future, it's not going to be like a whole rebuild to get to Drupal 11 or Drupal 12 or Drupal 13. It's going to be like, hey, you just kind of like update your code a little bit and like you're on Drupal 11, right? So I think these systems are going to be, that we're modeling are going to be have a much longer shelf life. So I think we kind of have to think about these things, going forward, as far as like, okay, like what's the future of this field look like? And that doesn't apply to everything. I think the e-commerce example that you guys have been using is a good one, because like e-commerce is kind of always evolving, always changing, right? So there are instances there, like you said, Sean, like, hey, you don't have a triple XL size now, but is that something you could have? And if so, like, how does this field handle that? So I think those are kind of some of the questions too, like answering those kind of future questions of like, okay, what happens 2 years from now when there are like 100 things in this taxonomy that we have to think about?
Yeah. Before I move on, anything you'd like to add, Sean?
No, I think, John, just to echo your point, like the autocomplete taxonomy term field is like something of my nightmares, because it's always that there's no forethought to like why anybody's doing this. And not always, but 99% of the time you'll end up with lots of one tags. And I think, kind of going forward into the future, thinking long term too, right? Like how you get like AI to tag content, and like what does that mean, and who's the thing doing the content entry is going to become more and more important over time too.
I feel like I want to dig into that a little bit. Like I personally like the autocomplete field in certain use cases, right? Like I like it when
you're not creating tags from it, when it's auto-completing pre-existing.
Right.
Yeah. Yes. So like I think it saves you though in some instances. Like when like a tag doesn't exist and you're adding that. Like I think when people start typing and like they see the tag, they're like, oh, okay, I'm gonna pick this one as opposed to creating a new one. But like open taxonomy fields are they're
that's where I was
feelings.
Starting.
Yeah. Mixed feeling.
Yeah. So one of the questions that I also have, I always have, and this is something where I probably change back and forth the most often, is how do you decide when you're going through these requirements what type of field something should be? So, for example, what's the difference between a plain text, a long text plain field, and a long text formatted field? In your mind, how do you make the decision between the two?
Yeah, from my perspective, I think a lot of it is, what is this going to be used for? And inevitably, somebody somewhere wants to put a superscript on something, and then you use plain text, and you're like, oh, well, now I have to like figure out what I'm going to do. Am I going to migrate it all for this one thing that's super important because it's a registered trademark, right? And has to be there from a legal compliance perspective, right? Or, do you bend it to use something on the front end to handle those one-off use cases? I've used a few modules to do those kinds of things where like I need it in a title field, and title field doesn't do that, right? A core title field, right? Yeah. But again, like a lot of it is, how many different editor modes am I going to have to maintain, right? Like this field only needs bold and links, and then this field needs everything under the sun, and then there's another field that needs like 3 things, right? I think a lot of it can really spiral out of control. I think unless I know for a fact that a field will never have any formatting applied to it, or will be like globally formatted, like it's always going to be bold on the front end, then, I tend to lean towards the WYSIWYG way. It just saves you down the line. Like I can't tell you how many times.
Okay. Next stage of that. What about formatted text versus formatted text with summary?
I mean,
do you use the formatted text with summary, like the base body field, or do you just use formatted text without a summary usually?
That's interesting. So I have a use case for that second one,
sure.
Right? So like going back to just your first question is like, to summarize Sean's point, I think it depends. So like for plain text fields, like I've had instances where you have to add like an ID to a URL, right? And the URL itself is like you're doing an embed script, and the embed script is like part of the field template, right?
Yeah.
And like the ID is just like plain text, like it's all numbered, alphanumeric or whatever. So like that's an instance where like plain text makes sense. But I think because with WYSIWYG, you have the ability to have different input formats for different fields. Like you have a lot more control there to say like, oh, well, if it's a body field, like, hey, whatever, WYSIWYG, go crazy. Or, if you have a text field that has a very specific set of like, hey, you can only do bold and italics in this text field. Like you can set different input formats. So, I think it just depends there on what your use case is for the field. As far as the formatted text with summary, so on my blog, I actually use the default body field with the summary because the summary is actually used on the main page of the blog, as opposed to using the trimmed text. I just use the summary text, and then I use the obviously the full blog text for the actual page, which gives a little bit more control. And I've typically used that way in the past. I don't know that that's common. I mean, maybe it is, but I think a lot of people avoid it.
Yeah, I just think it's funny that the default body field that's on the two content types that are default to the standard install profile, I personally pretty much never use it, because the clients that need to be able to edit that summary always forget to click the link and open it. So it's just a separate field. Like they have a teaser, and they have a teaser or summary field that they fill out.
That feels like a training issue to me. That doesn't feel like I don't think there's a need for a separate field there.
I agree, it's training, but if you end up having difficulty training the same thing over and over and over again, this is a great example of content modeling.
Right.
You can either train the people to click that link and look for it over and over again, or you can literally just give them a field called summary that they know to instinctually to fill out, right? Like if you can give an option that requires no training versus an option that requires training. Sorry, Sean.
No, there's options in the setup where you can enforce that thing to be open, right? Like, so you go down that path, but there is definitely like inflexibility, right? From a structured content perspective, like having a absolutely separate field is gonna win the day in most cases, in my mind. I rarely use the fallback of it's I'm just going to trim this to 300 characters and that's going to make sense.
Words of caution. I always try to stick as close to core as possible, because when you do your own field and develop your own trimming.
What do you mean? That is core. Like adding a new formatted text field or plain text field for the summary is core. Mm-hmm. I'm just not using the formatted with summary field, which is also core.
I mean, I guess so. If you're using different field types, I guess that's okay. But
that's all I'm doing.
Yeah, and I think unique. Nick, to your point, extra. Like how many people use the summary when it has to be toggled on versus if there's just a field there, right? And like you can't enforce summary, right? Like, and then styling summary was a big problem back in the day.
That is true.
You
can't make it required, right? So I guess that's a gotcha there.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. If trim is not acceptable, which in a lot of cases it's not, I pretty much 100% of the time add a field.
Every case it's not. Trim.
No, sometimes.
Trim drives me nuts. It works.
But anyway. Some people like ellipses.
There you go. All right. So let's change our focus, because we've been very very positive and like, hey, we're building content models and we're innovative. We're innovating here. I want to change that a little bit. So like, let's imagine our content model is done and it's been approved by the client, and we're like moving through our project, and we get halfway through or 3/4 of the way through, and then we realize we got it wrong.
Or requirement changed.
Or a requirement changed, or a new requirement was uncovered, right? We talked about this being a living document and a living process, right? So things can change. But how do you typically handle that change? What do you do? Go ahead, Nick. I can see it in your eyes. You're dying to say something.
I want to hear what Sean has to say first.
Yeah, I mean, owning it, I think, is probably the biggest thing you have to do, right? Owning it, coming up with the solution to the problem. Like I said, my primary one example was, I have a couple good ones. So one was we had a date and didn't have an end date, or it didn't have like duration or something, right?
Oh, that's the worst.
Right.
I hate that one.
You just had this one day field. It was just a date, and then like a month into the site being live, somebody's like, well, this goes on for 4 days, or this goes on for like 7 hours, and we need to know that. You didn't account for it, and then, you shoehorn it in, or you have to write some hook update to deal with this, which is a lot of the problem. One. Similarly, like, I have a client where there's two commerce is being used only for the price field. Like, the whole commerce suite is installed, but we only are using the price field. And I'm like, this is just bad. We should just have like two discrete fields, one for the US price and one for the UK price, or whatever the two price sets are. And like, now I have to, kind of undo that, right? It's like moving this data. But like, at the end of the day, I won't have to install this gigantic code base, right? There's a lot of things where you like, later down the line, you realize like, oh, it can be a lot simpler, or it needs to be more powerful, I think is probably more so the case than what anybody anticipated. And a lot of that, I guess, goes back to the not asking the right questions for future-proofing yourself. Or again, like, in the case of the event one, Smart Date didn't exist, and then Smart Date existed, and Smart Date's just better, right? And so where I move that data, I move the data. It's pretty important.
Yeah, I think there's two things. I mean, one, if you find out that something has changed or you get something wrong, you want to you update the document, but you also want to make sure you question you find if you made similar assumptions elsewhere. Because if you're going to update something, you want to make sure you update everything at once. You don't want to like update something and then a week later have to update another and then have to update another. Like you try to say like, oh, we made this assumption that this should be a list field and it really should be a taxonomy field. Let's take a quick look at the other list fields to make sure that we don't have to do the same thing, right? Then you just have to kind of modify and migrate the data. Now, there are some that are more painful than others, right? So for example, having a date field, not having an end date, that's painful. There are some that are easy, right? If you need to go from plain text to full text, that's fine, right? They might have to go in after and manually style something if they needed to bold something or something, right? But if you're going from formatted text to plain text, well, then you might have to deal with either outputting raw HTML or having to parse HTML, both of which are really painful. There's a bunch of different variables that go into it, and some are easy, some are difficult, right? Going from a list to a taxonomy, it takes a little bit of extra work to migrate something like that, but it's not too bad. But going from a media field to an image field, or vice versa, that can be a lot more work, right? But it boils down to see if you made the same assumption elsewhere, and if you have to update that, try to batch those updates, and then make the change.
I mean,
and make sure you've migrated the data. Something I always do, I always create the new field, especially on a live site. Create the new field, migrate the data, but hide that field from display. Double check that all the data migrated properly. Then switch all the templates and views to the new field. Usually run the migration one more time to pick up anything that was updated in the meantime. Switch it, hide the old deprecated field, double check it, let it run for a little bit, make sure that you didn't miss something key, and then delete the old field. Whereas if you're in development, sometimes you can just change the field, right? And then move on.
So two things I'll add there. One is, as far as taxonomy goes, I always go to a taxonomy unless it's like a set list of items, right? So like, yes, no, maybe, option one, option two, both. Like, if I know it's never going to change, I always, I will use a list, but typically I'll always go with the taxonomy, because without fail, and you could do this with a list too, I suppose, but without fail, typically that list will grow, and then like being able to filter and reference that, I feel like is a little bit easier. But I feel like we may or may not have had a show where we discussed that specific topic.
Well, there's one other place where I would use a list that doesn't fall into that category, and that's if you need to have something like a style, right? If you need to have a drop down that allows people to apply a style to something, I'll use a list because you can define the key in a
Mhm,
friendly way. I mean, you could use especially if you're going to output it as a class or something, you
mhm.
could use a taxonomy, but then you either have to have a lookup where you're like, oh, ID3 means this, and I'll put this
Yep.
class. Or you have to load the taxonomy term to get the name, then convert that to a clean class, and that can change, right?
Yeah.
Whereas if
Yeah.
you're using the key,
That's a great use case. Yeah, you
yeah,
have the ability to make the key the class and the readable item, the label.
yep,
The
Yeah,
other
and I
thing
do that
I
a lot
would,
of time too.
yeah,
yeah,
that makes a lot of sense. I think that's a great example. The other thing on the getting it wrong piece of it is like, Nick, I think said this earlier about documentation. Like, it's good to have good documentation on why a choice was made, right? A decision log, so that way you can go back to it when something changes. Um, to be able to say, hey, like we went down this road because of this, this, and this. Does it still apply? Like, how did we, basically like, how did we get here?
Hmm.
And sometimes things just change, and that's acceptable, but it's good to have that documentation to be able to look back and understand why the decision was made in the first place.
Yeah, for sure. And so just kind of rounding out this discussion, I think one of the things I've used in prior years has been a giant spreadsheet. Everybody loves a good spreadsheet. What
yeah.
else do you use to, document, to model these kinds of things? What tools or
I
software and
mean,
things are you using for this kind of stuff?
yeah, I think a spreadsheet is mandatory no matter what else you use, right? But I think the other big one is any of those like chart builders almost. I call them. Like there's that Figma board thing that not Figma itself, but there was
Hmm.
an add-on product you could add where you can just create like a flow chart almost,
Yep.
and creating the entity relationships there and just adding those fields can be helpful to see what needs to land where. But usually it's some combination of one of those bubble chart things and a spreadsheet. The spreadsheet will contain like here's the field, here's the machine name, here's the type it is, and if it's a list, like these are the values that go in that list. If it's a taxonomy, is it autocomplete or checklist or something, like it contains the Drupal specific information that you would need,
Hmm.
and then the bubble chart or whatever would create the relationships between things, like hey, this is an entity reference field that references this content type or this taxonomy or whatever.
Yeah.
It's
So
some
I
combination.
think like in the past, I've done kind of like a build spec. I used, I know, I think Palantir.net had a spreadsheet that they would use that was pretty in depth with all the field settings that you would need. So I've used that on the development side in the past. I found that kind of got a little bit cumbersome, both for people that are up, maintaining the documentation as well as the development team, because a lot of times kind of the fields are just like default values.
Hmm.
Um, so what I've kind of moved to and thinking now, like, we used to do kind of like the annotated wireframes where like you'd have kind of like broken out, you'd have like here's the page and here's the field and here are the values that need to be set for this field and how it needs to operate, right? And kind of left the developer to use best practices to kind of like fill out the rest of those field values. I think like a combination of those tools could be useful, but I'm thinking right now off the top of my head, like Miro could be a good wireframing /
Hmm.
Yes.
content modeling tool to be able to say like, okay, here's the list of the fields that this content type needs, and like here are the here are the values that we have to set and how it kind of links to like another content type or another
Yep.
entity, and so on and so forth. I think that could be really powerful, and something you want to think about when you're figuring out what tool or methodology to use is like, how does it export this? Because at the end
Hmm.
of the day, it has to be client understandable. right? Because you want to get that, sign off. You want to get that like, okay, yes, so I'm going to show this to you and it's going to make sense. And sometimes a spreadsheet does not achieve that goal.
For sure.
So
visual things are for visual learners.
It's true.
I want to mention too, before we close out too, UML is a good way of defining this kind of stuff. It's something markup language, but it's a way to define these types of things, but also have it in Git. So it's pretty easy to transport. It's pretty easy to kind of track. So again, if you need to prototype a different relationship set and show that, you can create a branch, make those changes, show it, and you're not like completely modifying it or throwing away something.
That's a unified modeling language, and for all those Lucid chart users out there, it looks like there's some sort of plugin that you can get to Lucid chart to be able to use that.
Well, thank you guys for joining me to talk about content modeling. It's been a long time since we talked about this in depth on the show about this topic.
Do you have questions or feedback? Reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or by email with show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel.
You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/TD-promo.
Get the Talking Drupal newsletter for show news, upcoming Drupal camps, local meetups, and much more. Sign up for the newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
And thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choosing Become a Patron. Okay, Sean. So if our listeners want to get in touch with you or had any questions, what's the best way for them to do that?
Sure. I'm Sean T. Walsh on most things. Drupal community Mastodon. Stopped using Twitter these days. And you can find me there. And business-wise, crowdcg.com is the site.
And how about you, John?
You can find me on all the major social networks and Mastodon, as well as Drupal.org at John Picozzi. And you can find out about EPAM at epam.com.
And you can find me pretty much everywhere at Nixvan, NICXVAN.
If you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking. Thanks a lot, everyone.
See you guys next week.